If you're here today, sorry, thank you for being here, and I'm going to take about 10 minutes of your time. That's all. If you're here today, I assume you know what Israel is doing in Gaza. I'm pretty sure that, like me, you feel angry and helpless. All healthy feeling human beings resonate with the indescribable shock, loss, fear, confusion, pain, and suffering that the genocidal settler colonial state of Israel is inflicting on our fellow human beings. I was born, raised, and educated in Israel. My grandparents on my mother's side were Holocaust survivors, and I served in the Israeli military, in the Israeli army between 1982 and 1984. In 2001, 10 years after emigrating to Australia, I renounced my Israeli citizenship in protest. These credentials do not give me more right to speak here than anyone else, but they do mean that I'm fluent in Hebrew and I can watch and read the Israeli media. I also have some insight into Jewish-Israeli society, its psychology and its aims. I do not misunderstand Israel and its intentions. I am not confused by what the misinformation disseminated by our media. I know what Jewish Israelis are saying inside their country to one another in Hebrew. I know what their media show them and how they portray Gaza and the Israeli military. Israeli society does not perceive the Palestinian people as human beings. When Israeli Jews think about Palestinians, they see Nazis, monsters who want to annihilate all Jews. If this sounds insane to you, it's because it is. But this is how we were all indoctrinated in Israel. Psychologically, Israeli society is like a cult. We have all been brainwashed to believe that the Jews are the greatest victims in human history, that the world will always hate Jews, and that Jews are not safe anywhere except in Israel. Survival of the Jewish people and protecting Israel are the most important principles in the lives of most Israeli Jews. Israeli Jews have access to world media, but the majority read and watch the Israeli media only. They do not want to see the images we see. They choose not to see their soldiers as the war criminals that we know they are. All over Israel, the military is portrayed as heroic, as the brave defender of Jewish people everywhere, not just in Israel. Israel is a product of the Zionist settler colonial project. Zionism began in the late 19th century. Its ultimate goal is and always has been to replace every last Palestinian with Jews all over historic Palestine. Israel has tried many leaders since 1948. They have each done their best to push the Palestinians into ever diminishing territories. Successive Israeli governments on the left and on the right have done everything possible to make Palestinian lives so unbearably hellish in the hope that they would leave voluntarily. This has not worked. The timing of the attack on Gaza was no coincidence, and neither is the fact that Netanyahu was brought back from the brink of prison and re-elected as prime minister. Israeli Jews have no illusions about Netanyahu. They know who and what he is. They rightly see him as the only one who has what it takes to finish the job and solve the Palestinian problem once and for all. Israeli society has grown increasingly impatient and worried about what they call the demographic time bomb. There are now as many Palestinians in historic Palestine as there are Jews. The birth rate among Israeli Jews has been in decline, which is why Israel has also escalated its effort to entice Jews from Western countries to move to Israel. The humanitarian catastrophe in Gaza is not an accident of war. It is Israel's goal. The indiscriminate bombings, the flattening of Gaza, the destruction of everything that was part of Gaza's residents' life are deliberate. The wholesale murder of children and babies, sick and disabled people, men, women of all ages, is intentional. The famine, the systematic destruction of hospitals, is intended to cause widespread disease, suffering, and death. Israel is creating this horror in Gaza to force the world to take in the Palestinian refugees. Israel hopes that there will be a tipping point beyond which Egypt will be bribed by the United States to let Gaza's refugees into Egypt. Israel does not care if Gaza's people are just dumped in the Sinai desert. Israel couldn't care less what happens to any Palestinian. It just wants them all out. It will escalate until it has achieved its goals. Inside Israel, everyone knows it. Just like their ancestors who were ethnically cleansed in 1948, Gaza's refugees will never be allowed back. In 1948, Israel ethnically cleansed 750,000 Palestinians. It deliberately and systematically destroyed 500 villages and towns to ensure that the refugees would have nothing to return to. This is not based on speculation. There is plenty of evidence. Please read any of Professor Ilan Pappé's books, especially The Ethnic Cleansing of Palestine or 10 Myths About Israel. I hear in our media some talk occasionally about rebuilding Gaza after the war. Anyone who imagined that Israel would allow any Palestinian back into Gaza and let them rebuild is delusional. Israel is already planning its own developments in Gaza and the occupied West Bank. They are doing as much demolition work in Gaza as possible to make it easier for their developers when they start building housing for Jews only, villas for the rich, and fancy resources near the sea. The traditional Zionist policy of creating facts on the ground is in full force. Palestine was a fully populated and thriving center of commerce, industrial, agricultural, and cultural activity before Zionists arrived. Israel has built itself on top of its ruins. Gaza is just a continuation, a repetition of what was done before, except this time on a much larger scale and with more sophisticated weaponry and propaganda. After Gaza is empty and flat, Israel will come for the occupied West Bank. The last group Israel is coming for are the Palestinian citizens of Israel. If the suffering of Gaza's residents is not horrific enough to witness, I find Western collusion with Israel unbearable. Instead of doing everything possible to force Israel to stop the atrocities it is committing and rescue its victims, the world keeps offering Israel money, weapons, technology, and political support. With a small number of exceptions, the media give Israel a platform. Our media give Israel a platform and allow it to continue to spread its narrative. It is not just politicians who seem to buy into Israel's fraudulent narrative of war against Hamas and Israel's entitlement. It is also ordinary people who are confused or afraid to speak up for fear of being branded anti-Semitic. I do not believe that world leaders really don't know what Israel is doing and what it is up to. The world has a long and disturbing history of allowing genocides to take their course and taking decades to end obvious injustices and human suffering that should have never existed in the first place. Everything we see now has all been done before many times in human history. The Palestinians are the more recent in a long list of victimized people to whom the world has turned their backs. Israel cannot be allowed to get away with it, but it already has back in 1948. And it is counting on the world to continue to do nothing. So far, Israel's expectations have been met. Israel feels it is the right time and it has a green light to complete its mission in Gaza and its wider settler colonial aims. As many of us have been warning for decades, the Palestinians in all of historic Palestine, not just Gaza, are on borrowed time. If the world does not intervene, Israel will continue to until it will achieve its aims. If it's any consolation to you, Israel is crumbling from within. But we need to help it crumble faster with severe sanctions and boycotts. Please do not get confused or doubtful when you see what our mainstream media report and how our own country and political parties are dealing with the genocide in Gaza and with Israel. Please do not be discouraged by accusations of anti-Semitism or by talk about the Holocaust. These are just known Zionist tactics to deflect from Israel's genocide and settler colonial aims. When a crime is committed, it does not matter who commits it. It does not even matter who the victims are. A crime is a crime. Everyone I know wonders what our individual little voices can accomplish. I am wearing my suffragette scarf today to remind myself that if it wasn't for a small minority of persistent, vocal and visible women and men, women in this country would still not be allowed to vote. In their time, the suffragettes were seen as extremists. They were vilified, called every name you can imagine, beaten and arrested by police, not just for standing in the streets and holding signs. In prison, when they went on hunger strikes, they were brutally force-fed. They were seen as a major threat to orderly civil society. All injustice is wrong. All forms of harm that humans cause other humans are wrong. What the suffragists asked for, we now take for granted because it is so obvious. Demanding an immediate end to a genocide is also obvious. Together, we can make sure the Palestinians know they have not been forgotten and that genocide does not just disappear. Together, we can put pressure on our politicians and make Palestine an election issue for all parties. Together, we show that we do not sit quietly and tolerate our politicians' inhumanity and callousness about human life. Together, we can hit Israel's pockets by boycotting its Israeli products. Together and individually, we can educate more people so we can defeat Israeli Zionist propaganda and its helpers in our Western media. Together, we can flood our newspapers with letters and flood the BBC and other channels with complaints about their pro-Israeli bias and their immorality. We don't need to justify why we oppose a genocide. It is those who collude with genocide and settler colonialism that need to explain why they support a perpetrator instead of its victim. Thank you so much for listening.
Thank you so much, everybody. That was so